Hi, I'm actor Ian Champion, and welcome to History of Horror Cinema, my personal podcast tour of the good, bad, and the ugly of horror movie history. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe. Friday the 13th, Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, 1989. After 7 installments, it was becoming clear that Sean S. Cunningham's Friday the 13th franchise was running out of steam. Whilst they still turned a profit, the producers and writers were so bereft of ideas for their location-centered horror icon that they resorted to changing Jason's location instead in increasingly desperate ways. Over the course of the next 3 films, they would move him to hell and outer space, but not before having him carve out a slice of the Big Apple, New York City. Tragically, if this movie was a skyscraper there, they'd have condemned it for being unsafe on every level. This is easily the most abysmal entry in this series so far. The premise had some merit when you consider how many urban horror movies there already were where a serial killer thrives anonymously in the potentially soulless urban space. Handled well, with more support, maybe Jason Takes Manhattan could have worked. The returning Jason, actor Kane Hodder, certainly felt the love from fans on the street when he filmed a defining shot standing in Times Square. Appreciative crowds had to be roped back in their hundreds during the shooting as they witnessed his backwoods big-game human hunter framed in the neon glow of the metropolis. However, under a studio regime whose only interest was in spending as little money as possible to amplify the dwindling profit margin, the finished movie was sabotaged from the outset. Writer-director Rob Hedden approached the project sincerely. He had previously directed a couple of episodes of Friday the 13th the series, and was delighted to be offered a crack at his own movie sequel. Although Paramount's executive producer, Frank Mancuso Jr., was now taken up with higher-class studio fare, he merely replied, "Go for it," when Hedden asked how much leeway he had to kill off Jason for good. The studio knew that no matter what corner the indestructible behemoth was painted into, they'd find a way to resurrect him if the box office numbers were good enough. Hedden's vision was to at least have half the movie take place in New York to justify the title and get the most value out of having Jason juxtaposed against familiar city locations. In a gradual war of bottom-line-inspired attrition, this was whittled down to the point where the studio would only finance a single week there. In the final edit, 63 of the film's 100 minutes takes place on the so-called cruise ship that transports the graduating cast of Crystal Lake High students. In effect, the movie largely becomes Jason Takes a Cruise. Even the ship itself was victim to cost-cutting. The chosen one was downgraded to a cheaper, smaller craft. This ended up sinking the leaky vessel of the franchise even further. It's best to cut a sway through the young cast as Jason mercifully does, for this sequel features the worst performances in the series so far. There's nary a scene that goes by where a discerning viewer doesn't self-administer a facepalm of, "Good grief, couldn't they have recast this guy, or at least tried another take?" Even the editor's son, Tim Merkovich, playing the boy Jason in hallucinations suffered by final girl Rennie Wickham, Jensen Daggett, is atrociously weak. Jason Takes Manhattan also contains the dullest staged kills in the franchise so far, which wouldn't be such a focus if, let's face it, that weren't their sole raison d'etre. Kelly Hugh's student is simply strangled in an unimaginatively shot sequence on the ship's disco floor. Worse still is the teen who is merely tossed overboard. These would be forgivable if they were intended to be stronger meat pre-certification. Yet Hedden had conceived most of them in multiple versions that were still tedious when extended. The only murder that stands out is the impromptu rooftop boxing bout between Jason and V.C. Dupree. This does look like a reasonable attempt at giving our hillbilly hockey mask killer a somewhat worthy opponent. Dupree lands roughly 67 authentic punches to Jason's torso, Hodder recalled, and as he staggers with convincing fatigue, inevitably Jason literally knocks his block off, sending Dupree's head spinning down onto the street. Because of these pesky budget limitations, what are mainly passed off as New York scenes were actually filmed in Vancouver, a physical challenge as the spotless Canadian city sets had to be dirtied considerably to imitate the pre-Giuliani era in central New York. The overall look and feel of the movie is extremely dated, a very 80s saturated neon cityscape coupled with a guitar and keyboard-heavy hair rock-sounding score from Fred Mollin, his first as sole composer for the series. Fans of Troma films may find the tone awfully, in every sense, reminiscent of Lloyd Kaufman's deliberately bad Meisterworks, especially in its reliance on Toxic Avenger-style chemical waste to dispatch Peter Mark Richmond's humdrum Uncle Charles to Rennie, and even Jason himself. Arguably, this represents a comeuppance for Charles, since in a flashback he gave Rennie a tough love swimming lesson by pushing her into the same crystal lake that Jason spent 2 decades unbelievably living beneath. The aforementioned biohazard brings us to the climax that aptly takes place in a sewer. Ronnie and Sean, Scott Reeves, escape from Jason as the tunnels flood with toxic liquid garbage. Hedden decided that as part of his terminal mark on the series, he would finally erase the adult Jason by restoring his post-chemical body to that of the prepubescent innocent boy before the horror began. If this seems sufficiently well up to the former standards of nonsensical endings, you should see the one Hedden opted not to use, where the child emerges from inside the jaws of the man. Jason Takes Manhattan ultimately took relatively little in ticket sales. From a budget of $5 million, almost $1 million over the planned $4.2 million, it grossed only $8.1 million, leading to a final tally of just $22.2. For the first time, the figures showed Paramount that they could no longer coast on automatic pilot from the inherited goodwill of former sequels. There would be a gap of 4 years before they dared to try again. Stay tuned. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe.